It's great to be here. We'll start off with a little video. I'll set this up, and most of you probably are too young to remember this, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, AT&T had an ad campaign that talked about all these things that were cool and things that you would do. Some of the guys here on the front row probably remember this one. It was saying, you ever want to send a fax from the beach? Well, this was before email, so faxes were cool in those days. And it was all these things that we talked about, well, you will do that. And it was a series of things. You may remember the ad campaign. Well, now, the things that we looked at, and some maybe 20 years later, I mean, that seems so passé. I mean, it was old 10 years ago. So our ad agency started looking at some of those things and said, well, what do we think the next 10 years are going to do? And they've been working with some of those things, and this is one of the spots that they've done. So I'll share that with you, and we'll get into the material.
Have you ever learned American history? From George Washington.
And it was victory in Saratoga that turned the war.
Compose a masterpiece while having heart surgery. Or explored the surface of strange new worlds from the comfort of your home. You will. And the company that will bring it to you, AT&T.
So I can tell you the things that we looked at there are not at all far-fetched. Some of the work that we're doing with healthcare initiatives, Ken and I were talking about earlier today, some of the bio-integrated devices that can actually go into your clothes. If you're an athlete and you're looking to improve your performance and you want to monitor what you're doing either through a workout or on a daily basis and then upload that information. We've been working with people like Under Armour to do that kind of, develop those kind of products. If you're an elderly person or have cardiac problems, as an example, the ability to sew that information into your clothes and be able to monitor you, identify a problem if it comes out. There's just a tremendous amount of things that are underway at this point in time. So I'd like to share a little bit with you on that, and then leave time for my favorite part, which is kind of the Q&A at the end. But let me kind of go through a few things. I asked my chief of staff to pull out a picture of the campus. He didn't have to go all the way back to 1900. Let me make it clear, I was not here when this picture was taken. It's not quite that long ago, but if you look at what's happened now, it's so exciting to see this campus, and particularly this Centennial campus. It is world class, and I can tell you from my time in the industry what you're doing here with integrating the electrical engineering department and computer science departments in such a collaborative way is world class, and I think it leads a few industries, or a few universities are doing it, but I think it's a real leading position that you're taking here. So I'm so delighted to see what's happened at the school here, and it makes me really proud to be an NC State graduate. Other things have changed. I can tell you that's what I looked like in 1979, and I've changed a little bit too. So change is something that's with us always, but I can tell you nothing, whether you look at the changes of the university, the changes that I've gone through as I get more wrinkles and gray hair, nothing compares to the change that I've seen in the industry that I'm in and that many of you are starting to go into. The pace of technology is just phenomenal. So I'd like to kind of go through a little bit of history and walk you through that. Today we'll go over the kind of an overview of AT&T so you can think of, well, gee, what is it that you do? And I'm sure that a lot of you are familiar with facets of our business, whether it's the wireless services we provide or the business services we provide. But I'd like to kind of give you an overview of what we do. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the industry landscape and how incredibly different it is today than it was in 1979 when I started in it. We'll talk about some of the changing business models, because those of you that are in technology fields, and I assume that most of the people in here are in computer science or double E, you kind of have to look at the broader picture of the landscape of the industry you're working in. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'd like to share a little bit of the management of the technology industry, some of the thinking that we have here. Most of this is kind of, frankly, what I've picked up over the last 32, 33 years, and how you lead in that environment. I think leadership is probably pretty standard, but I think there are some nuances in a high-tech world, and I'd like to at least share some thoughts with you. So does that work for you guys? Yeah. All right, we'll get going. AT&T is just kind of overall, I like to think we're the leading provider in the world of these services. We're clearly one of them. We have over 100 million wireless customers. We have nearly 11 million emerging devices. And you say, what do you mean by emerging devices? Emerging devices are the kind of things I talked about. Some of you may not realize that an e-reader that you're looking at is an emerging device. Or some of the dog collars that can actually track a pet. That's an emerging device for us. We've worked on things like pill bottles. So if you have an elderly parent that lives alone, you can monitor whether they're opening their pill bottle 3 times a day when they're supposed to and taking their medication. And if you're not getting that text message when that pill bottle should be opening, then you can make a phone call and see what's going on. So 11 million emerging devices, I will tell you, that's just the beginning. There are going to be so many more of those as we roll out these capabilities. 25,000 text messages every second. Probably 1,000 out of this room some days, I don't know. We'll have 17 million broadband connections. This is on the landline side. We have almost 4 million UVerse subscribers, and that's a service I know we're fairly new in rolling out in this area. And the biggest question I get is, why can't I get it in my neighborhood? It is really, I think, representing the next wave of entertainment services, and so it's pretty cool. We'll talk a little bit about that. We have about 220,000 Wi-Fi hotspots globally. We have more Wi-Fi hotspots than anybody else in the industry. We have the fastest mobile broadband network. Our HSDPA Plus is currently the fastest version. We're in the process of rolling out LTE. 100% of the Fortune 1000 companies are customers of ours. That's pretty neat. And we're located in Dallas, Texas. Last but not least, we have really an intense focus on customer service, and that's probably my primary job. While I'm managing technology day in and day out, and I'm living by my pager and cut cable outages and undersea earthquakes and all that, the key thing that I try and do is make sure that we put all that technology together, make sure it operates when it's supposed to, keep it up and running, and do it in a manner that results in a good customer experience. So this is one of my favorite charts, and part of the reason it's one of my favorite charts is when I was with Bell South, I was very proud of the company we were. It's a great company, but we didn't have the global reach. I would sit in my office in Atlanta and look across the highway at Coca-Cola or look down the highway at Delta Airlines, and I would meet with them and say, you know, you should be doing business with us. And the answer would always be, Bell South is a great company. You guys do great work for us, but you don't have the global reach we need. Well, now with a combination of AT&T, I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, nobody has a map that matches that kind of global coverage. And what we do is we not only reach most parts of the world, we reach most parts of the world with diversity, triversity, and then some. For example, if you look over at the area of Japan, last year you may remember the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. Well, that took out 12 undersea cable segments. What you typically see when you have an undersea earthquake like that, the cable where it comes up through the continental shelf, the shelf will break off, and when it does, oftentimes it'll sever the cable. We had 12 undersea faults. We didn't lose service to anybody in Asia. I thought that was pretty incredible. We have so much capacity in and out of Asia that we could reroute. Now, to show how demanding our customers are, however, the round trip latency from the West Coast to Asia and back went from 140 milliseconds to about 220 milliseconds, and we got calls from customers saying, what's going on? What's the problem? That's pretty demanding, right? I mean, we're getting close to the point where the speed of light is a controlling factor of what you can do. So anyway, you can see what we've got. We've got 38 internet data centers globally, so we can host content for a global company. If they want to tailor content for different parts of the world, we can do that. and almost 1 million fiber miles around the world. And last but not least, more than 1 billion devices connected to the network. You say, well, how do you know? We monitor IP addresses. So there are 1 billion devices around the world that are connected to our network in some way, shape, form, or fashion. We invest heavily. This chart is not my favorite chart because it kind of divides wireless and wireline. The fact of the matter is that's a distinction you can't really make anymore. All the fiber that we put in the ground, if you go to one of our work centers and you see the people that are out building fiber optic cable, today it's just as likely going in to serve cell sites to provide more capacity for 4G or LTE. In fact, that's the more likely place it's going in today. So if you forget the line and the shift from wireless to wireline, the fact of the matter is, though, that we're spending about $20 billion a year investing in our network. And you see on this chart it says $95 billion in the last 5 years. AT&T has spent more capital in this country for the last 4 years that I know of, and I suspect 5 years, than any other private entity. We don't compete with the federal government on spending money, but when it comes to investing capital, we've spent more in this country than anybody else. I never dreamed I would have a $20 billion capital budget, and I certainly never dreamed that it would be not enough to do all the things we want to do. But we'll talk a little bit about the growth and what's driving that. Let's first, though, talk a little bit about the industry landscape. If you go back to the days when I joined this industry in the late 70s, change really happened in decades. So you may remember the name MCI, that's now part of Verizon. You clearly probably remember the AT&T name. It was a very different AT&T back then. I can tell you, though, I was there. It's nothing like the AT&T of today. But it was measured in decades. If you looked at what started happening, and I would say this was probably in the late 80s, early 90s, things really started picking up. Some of it was based on internet technology. A lot of it was based on optical technology. A lot of it was based on wireless technology. But I would say to you that technology is the primary thing that drove these changes. And you can see what started happening into the industry at that point in time. Now, I believe that we're in an industry where things change in months. And I will tell you, I serve on the board of an optical company in Silicon Valley that's probably one of the 4 or 5 premier optical component companies in the world. I mean, they're one of the few companies that can do 100 gigabit per second coherent optics. Not very many people can do that. And I can tell you that in that industry, if you miss the market by 60 or 90 days to one of the other handful of people that can do it, that may be the end of you. That's how critical it is. So these kind of companies, almost every development is almost a bet the company kind of development, and timing really matters. In 2010, it was a $1.8 trillion industry, and about almost a third of a trillion capital investment to keep it going. So clearly a pretty high stakes game when you look at those kind of investments and the need to make sure that you've got a return on those investments. Another thing that's pretty important about the industry today is the changing nature of partnerships. If I look at everybody on this chart, Microsoft, Cisco, Apple, Google, IBM, they're all very strong partners of AT&T. In many ways, they're all competitors of AT&T. It's something you have to get used to in today's world. So I could look at any of these people. If I wanted to pick Google, for example, Google Mail, we have email services, Google has email services. If I look at Apple, there are Apple messaging services, we have messaging services. Microsoft embeds voice over IP capabilities into a lot of their software. We offer those services. You got to kind of get over that. We're in a world today that I think probably codependency is as good a name as I can think of it, but key players in the industry have to learn to cooperate and work together, even though in one meeting you may be a partner, the next meeting you may be a competitor. You have to be able to work through that and do that on a regular basis. That's not something that comes naturally necessarily. Our business models are changing a lot as well. If you look at what's happened in the old days, in the 90s, you can see, low-speed dial-up internet kind of services and wired broadband going up from there. As things started getting faster, you can see, we went to 2G wireless, 3G wireless, 4G wireless. For example, I've got, well, I'll put it in my pocket. This little device here is an LTE, we call it a puck. I think the marketing guys have come up with a more fancy name for it, but those of us in technology and operations call it a puck. This is a 4G device that also functions as a Wi-Fi hotspot. Some of my colleagues keep this thing, we've got 4G pretty pervasive in Dallas. We've got it turned up in Raleigh. We're still expanding. I think we went live in Durham this week or about to go live in Durham. But I know people just keep this in their pocket all the time and have all of their devices into the secure Wi-Fi code. And so they've got a 4G network following them around everywhere they go. And as I've done testing on our network in Dallas, for example, I've gotten as high as 39.5 megabits per second on the LTE network. We routinely get speeds in the 8, 9, 10, 12 megabits per second. So it's enabling a lot of new things to happen. A lot of it is driving the traffic growth we see here. So we started out with email, texting, web browsing apps. Now video is a huge part of the traffic on our network. In fact, it's one of the things that we're wrestling with. You've probably been reading a little press about our company lately, some of it positive, some of it not so positive. But the fact of the matter is our average user's traffic is going up about 40% per year. I can't believe the number of people, as we look at usage, I can't believe the number of people that are watching Netflix movies on their mobile device. I mean, YouTube I get, that makes sense to me, but to sit and watch routinely multiple full feature-length films on your mobile device is something that, frankly, I probably wouldn't think about doing, but a lot of our customers do. So it's kind of an insatiable demand for capacity, and that's why we're out there every day trying to put more fiber in, trying to build more backbone, trying to make sure that we got more coverage throughout the world because things have changed tremendously. We've got a lot of future drivers, as you see, from video on demand, immersive communications, this holographic stuff that you saw in the video that was kind of showing George Washington teaching a history lesson. There's more work going on in that regard than you might realize. So it's designed to be able to immerse somebody into an experience. All the things that we talk about here are driving more and more growth in traffic, and that's what we're doing to try and make sure that we can handle it. The other thing that's happening is the mobility nature of it. So most all of us now are completely connected wherever we happen to be. I mean, I never worry about, being away from my computer. I've got my iPad or my laptop. I'm always connected wherever I happen to be, pretty much anywhere around the world. Our network is one of the better international roaming coverage networks, so no matter where I go, I'm pretty well connected. In fact, my wife sometimes complains that we used to be able to travel some places in the world and I could get away from email. Now we haven't found one that works. But the bottom line is, if you look at what's happening with virtualization and mobility, it's kind of a match made in heaven. You say, well, what do you mean by virtualization? That means basically hosting a lot of the things that you do in the cloud. So you don't have to worry about where it is anymore. Your applications can run in our cloud, whether you're in Raleigh, whether you're in San Francisco, London, Singapore, Mumbai, it doesn't matter. You can access those applications, do whatever you need to do, and you don't have to worry about it. One of the things that enterprise customers like about that, do you know any company other than a power company that generates its own power routinely? Do you know any company that generates its own or runs its own water treatment facility? No, they rely on people that do that professionally. So why wouldn't you look at the same concept around data centers? More and more companies are saying, gee, I don't need to have a big data center, particularly when that equipment probably has about an 18 to 24 month life cycle at most. Let me give that responsibility to somebody else and let them do it. So that's why we partner with a lot of other people to do cloud services, people like IBM. One of the other things that we're doing that I think is a bit unique is we're opening up the network with APIs that allow other people to figure out ways to use our network. We have opened innovation centers in Palo Alto, Richardson, Texas, and Israel to develop new capabilities. And what we do is we let developers come in essence, play with the network and figure out ways to make it do new things. You say, well, what kind of thing might you want to do with that? Let's say video transcoding. Let's say that you've got a high-quality telepresence video conference going, but one person needs to join from their iPad. Does that just work automatically? No, you have to transcode the video to make it work effectively. You can put an API in the network that a third-party developer can activate so you can do those kind of things. There are some, maybe there are a whole host of what I would call really high-tech applications, but there's some more simple ones. My wife and I have a house up in the edge of the mountains of South Carolina that we hope to retire to someday. Every time I come back from Dallas and land, I have a little routine. I need the most important sustaining elements of life, right? I need to buy groceries, I need to buy gas, and I need to buy beer, right? There's something with my credit card company that you buy those three things, you're going to get blocked off as being a suspected fraud, right? And I've tried buying it in different orders. I'm telling you, they're pretty good at this stuff. Imagine an API that the bank could reach into the network and say, wait a minute, Bill I think I may have a case of fraud. He normally lives in Dallas. He normally uses his credit card in Dallas. He's in South Carolina. He just purchased the first item I'm worried about. If you could look in there and say, well, wait a minute, I can test geolocation on his device. He is, in fact, in South Carolina. You say, well, what if somebody maybe stole his phone and his credit card? Well, you could perhaps look and see, have I been texting and or calling people on my contact list? If I landed and made a phone call to somebody on my contact list and or texted somebody on there, you probably have a pretty good idea that that is me using that device, and you don't need to put me through the hassle as a credit card company of blocking the transaction, so I have to go call in and get it all undone. I mean, I just use that as a simple example, but it's not just the really sophisticated high-tech things that make this work. I think there are ways to make our lives better day in and day out, and we're trying to open up access to the network so developers can think of things that, frankly, we would never think of. It's not unlike what Apple has done in the Apple Store or what Google does with Android. If you build a platform and you make it available easy for a lot of other smart people to use, they'll figure out things that you would never even imagine. So that's kind of the approach we're on, only we're doing it not on a computing platform, but on a network platform. So what about the business of technology? Well, here are a few things I would characterize with it. It's capital intensive. As I mentioned before, we spent more capital than any other company, private entity in this country for the last 4 years, I'm sure of, and I think probably 5. Sometimes high tech is unlike building a building. If you build a building, you spend capital to build a building, are you unsure how long it's going to last? Is it unlikely to become obsolete? 2 buildings, is one unlikely to become obsolete? No, you've got a pretty, there's some things that can happen, but generally, if you build buildings or most capital investments, if you build factories, you typically have a pretty set depreciation cycle. Not in the technology world. So as you make decisions, you have to say, okay, I'm going to go out and deploy this 40 gigabit per second system, and I'm going to spend, $20 million on this international route. What happens if a 100 gigabit per second system comes out in a year and I've only started depreciating the one I'm on? So you have to make those decisions, I would say, get more difficult in a high-tech industry. You oftentimes also have to pick what I'll call pick a horse to ride before there's a clear winner. I'll give you an example. In the wireless technology world, there was a CDMA technology, code division multi-access, and GSM technology for 3G. And I remember very well in the days of Singular, before we put everything together at AT&T, the jury was out on which one of those technologies was going to win. Some people felt strongly that CDMA was the way to go. Others felt strongly that GSM was the way to go. But the fact of the matter is we had to make decisions before it was clear which one was going to win. Ultimately, GSM won, in my opinion, because it was by far the largest adoption around the world. And sometimes it's like the old videotape, the VHS versus beta. It's not always the best quality solution or the best technical solution that wins. But if worldwide adoption takes off and that drives your costs down, that ultimately becomes a winning solution. A lot of times technology drives other business impacts. It drives for our business back office support costs. This year, for example, we had a couple of cases where suppliers of ours rolled out software that was less than perfect, and it drove a lot of problems back into our call centers. So you have to realize that the technology has a tremendous downstream impact, and sometimes the maturity curve is unclear. So if you look at typical technology maturity curves, you have introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. It's not always clear where you are on that. So if you look at kind of some of the items that we have here, Digital Life is a new capability that we're building that is basically taking a number of things that you can think of and trying to network enable them. Some of the simpler ones are things like, energy consumption in your home, alarm systems, those kind of things. But it's, I think, the precursor to some of the things that we talked about earlier with monitoring health and many other things. So we're very early on there, but if you look throughout the whole range of the curve, all the way down to a plain old telephone service called POTS, as the industry has called it, is very much in a decline. But it's not always clear when you start doing a new technology deployment, it's not always clear exactly what that maturity curve is going to be, whether you get started with one and then something else comes along and displaces it. So as you look at trying to hit a market with the right technology at the right time, sometimes it gets a little bit testy to make sure you're doing it at exactly the right spot. So what are some of the strategies? Well, I think do your homework is first and foremost. And I'll give you an example of that. We, as AT&T, don't build any equipment outside of a laboratory. We might put together some lab prototypes, but we don't build routers, we don't build optical systems, we don't build video codecs. But we have researchers, PhD level researchers, that understand them in intimate detail, because we have to know that we're getting the right solution from the right company, and you don't do that blindly, not in the high-tech world. So you have to do your homework and make sure that you know you're getting the right thing. You have to understand key decision point timing. I mentioned earlier, in some of these areas, if you're 60 or 90 days behind the market, you've missed the market. And I look at kind of the optical company that I was talking about. If you've got a major supplier and you're competing for their business, if you miss that one, there may not be enough of a market left. So you have to really understand what the timing and key decision points are for making those moves. I think partnering makes a lot of sense when you can to mitigate risk. If you do something all on your own and it goes badly, then you've got to eat the entire cost of having done it. If you put partners together, quite often you can figure out ways to mitigate that risk. And certainly, you got to understand, if you do have the opportunity to change options, you need to understand what those might be. Or are there key decision point timings where you may say, we're going to go to prototype, but we got an opportunity when we finish our prototype to decide to proceed into manufacturing or not. So you kind of need to lay out that schedule and understand what that might be. I think you got to constantly monitor your position, but avoid analysis paralysis. And analysis paralysis is when you get so focused on trying to revisit every issue that you never make a decision to move forward. I can't think of a single successful technology company that has gotten involved in analysis paralysis. Now, I'm not saying that you pick a direction and you go off blindly and you never look back, but you got to make sure that you're constantly assessing the situation, that you know what's going wrong. And then last but not least, looking for international trends. The U.S. is a huge market, but the global market is much more important. And if I looked back to the example I used with CDMA and GSM, one of the reasons that we chose to go with GSM was because it was by far the global selection. Now, would you rather be relying on technology developments and cost curves that 20% of the world is using or that 80% of the world's using? The volumes of 80% are going to drive cost curves a lot quicker, right? And if you look at most high-tech businesses, literally it gets to the point where pennies matter at the unit level. So international trends are really important in doing that. So that's kind of what we look at in terms of the business side, the technology side. What is constant throughout all of that? If you're leaving school and you're going into the workforce and you're looking to lead teams of developers or teams of engineers, the leadership element is pretty constant. So a lot of things change. I think sound leadership doesn't change. I put together a few thoughts that I believe, at least in my view, make a difference. First and foremost is, I think, be yourself. I do not believe in this cookie cutter theory of management, that you do everything one way and you have to look at it with the same result. Now, there are some foundational principles that you have to stick with. You have to be results driven. You have to make sure that you look at deadline. There are things you do, but I think back to my early time in my career. I had, over a couple of year period, 2 different division managers at that point in time. One was a very detail-oriented person. He got into every facet, every detail of everything we did. And he was very successful. The other one didn't get into that level of detail, but said, here's the clear outcome I'm expecting. And I expect you to get that. If you need my help, I'm here, but I'm looking for this outcome. Do you understand? He was very successful. They were 2 of the top performers in our business, but they got there from very different ways. So my belief is, if you're not being yourself, you can't be a good leader. You can't pretend to be somebody you're not, but you got to stick to some foundation. So what I would say to you as you look at starting your career and moving up the ladder, find out what works for you, but make sure that you're covering the fundamentals. If you do that, I think you'll be fine. The second item is one that I stole from Ronald Reagan. If you remember, in Ronald Reagan during the Cold War years, he had a term, trust but verify. I think that works in business. But let me be clear, it's not that you distrust somebody, somebody, I was talking to a group one time and somebody said, well, that sounds like you're skeptical or that you don't really trust people. That's not really the case at all. If you're leading a big project and you think that you've gotten a clear communication on a point, and you go away till the project's over and you find out that you really didn't have a constant view, you're in deep trouble, right? It's pretty much over at that point in time. If you periodically test to make sure that what you think the expectation is you're on the same page, in other words, that's what I call trust but verify. It's not saying that I don't believe you're going to do what I need you to do, but I'm going to periodically verify that we're on the same page and you are, in fact, delivering what the expectation is. I think that serves you very well. Next one, understanding skill versus will. As a leader, probably one of your primary responsibilities is to assess the operation and understand what's working. Most everyone I've ever been a part of had some things that weren't working. I can tell you one thing. It said earlier, I've got about 100,000 people in my organization today. There's one thing I'm absolutely sure of. Not all 100,000 of them are doing the right thing every minute, right? So you've got to look at that and assess what's going on. And I think I like the notion of breaking down, if you've got something that's not working, is it a skill issue or is it a will issue? Skill issues generally are pretty easy to fix. Need a little more training. We've got somebody doing a job they're really not prepared to do. We can fix that pretty easily. Or maybe even put a person who's got the better skills in place, but those are easy to fix. Will issues get a little bit more challenging, and you can't just automatically assume, well, the person, there's a will problem here, they're just lazy, they don't want to do it. The person may be going through a difficult problem, situation at home, The person may have a seriously ill family member. There's a lot of things that can be distracting somebody when it comes to the will issue. But going about fixing the problem is very different if it's a skill problem or a will problem. So that's one thing you got to sort out and fix and decide what the right approach is. The next one's providing meaningful feedback. I've seen through my career that there are people who everybody loves to work for Joe or Dave or Sue because Sue tells everybody they're wonderful, right? What's really tough is when a corporation goes through a change, particularly if you have to go through a downsizing, and all the people that have been told they've been wonderful are not all wonderful. And even if you take 20 people who all think they're wonderful and you rank order them, somebody's going to be number 19 and 20. It's not fair to people as a leader not to give them specific, actionable feedback. I think anybody, if you work for somebody and they're not giving you that kind of feedback, you ought to demand it because they're not doing their job. So the worst thing that I've ever had happen is the situation I just described. Taking over an organization, everybody is rated as whatever rating scale you've got, far exceeds expectations, you pick it. Every company's got a different one. Everybody's rated great. And for whatever reason, you've lost business, you lost a contract, something's happened, and you got to reduce your headcount by 10%. Imagine the surprise on that person's face who just got rated far exceeds expectation when they found out they're the lowest performer in the group. Their manager wasn't doing the job. So you got to be providing meaningful feedback. The next one is look in the mirror. This is a concept from a couple of really great management authors, Jim Collins well, Jim Collins is probably the one that championed this. And his notion is if things are looking great, look at a window and see who you can find that gets the credit for it. If things aren't going well, look in a mirror and see what you've done or what you need to do differently to make it better. And I think the concept, it may sound a little bit hokey, but it's really the right kind of view for a leader, right way a leader should have. Another thing that Collins has, and he's written a number of books, they're great books, I'd encourage you to get them. Good to Great is probably one of my favorites, but he talks about the concept of a level 5 leader. Has anybody in here read any of his stuff? Maybe, yeah. A level 5 leader is the top, the pinnacle of leadership. But most of the people that you and I would think about as being the famous leaders are probably level 4 leaders. Level 5 leaders tend to be people that you've never heard of. And why are they level 5 leaders then? They're people, and I'll mess up the quote, I'm sure, but it basically says they use a combination of humility and perseverance to deliver results. They're not the person that's on CNN every time something's happening in the business world. I mean, we all know who those are. But there are a handful of people who have produced consistently for decades incredible performance. And guess what? There are also people who, when time comes for them to move on, they've got 2 or 3 really great people ready to take their position. But they're not egomaniacs. It's not about them. It's about building the organization. So if you really want to read about leadership and the way to do things, I would encourage you to look at some of Jim Collins' work, and there's a few others, but that's really a good one. Last but not least, I think giving people a reason to believe. I like to use at AT&T, one of my favorite movies of all time is Apollo 13. And it's not because it's a movie, it's because it really happened. I had the opportunity one time, we brought Gene Kranz, who ran Mission Control during the Apollo 13 episode. He came in and spoke to a group, and you're with a true legend. It's incredible to spend a little time with him. But time and time again, you run into situations where people feel like they can't do something. And your job as a leader is to give them a reason to believe that they can. That, gee, yeah, it may be tough, maybe there's an 80% chance this is going wrong, but would you believe with me, would you agree that if we do this, this, and this, there's at least a 20% chance we're going to get this right, and therefore let's go give it a shot. Time and time again, I've seen people who, given a reason to believe, are able to do things that they would never dreamt they could do. So, and that's where I would kind of close on the leadership side, is that, you know, a lot of times we think about managers, we think about what are typical management traits that you would think about? Well, focus on cost management, focus on schedules and deadlines, you know, focus on efficiency, right? Those are all management traits. I think those are all important traits. They're all necessary, but they're not sufficient. I think if you really want to go into leadership, you need those management traits, but you also have to take the other part of it, which is, in my mind, and if you can look at, I did a little exercise. I looked at Webster, looked for the definition of leadership, and they all fell kind of short in my mind. In my mind, leadership is when you get people inspired to do something that they really didn't think they could do. Anybody, well, a few of you in this room were probably here when Jim Palvano was here. I was. Was there any reason why the team he coached should have won a national championship? No, no. He had that team playing so far beyond their capabilities, it was phenomenal. But it was his leadership that convinced them that they could win a national championship. That applies in business as well. So I would encourage you, those are just a few things that I look at, and I think that if you take them, adapt them, use them to your to whatever works for you, but I think that you'll find that they help you as you go into the workforce. So with that, I'm going to stop and go to my favorite part of a session like this, and that is to hear what questions you have, what's on your mind, and anything that, that you'd like to ask. Come on, I know there's a ball game coming up, right? What time does the Duke game start? 9. Okay, we got time. We got time. Yes.
The last mile problem. You put big networks in, you do everything, but it's always the U.S. and any place else. It's easy in the cities, but in the rest of the U.S., how do you solve the last mile problem?
That is one of the biggest challenges, probably of all the things I worry about. You know, I won't say it keeps me awake at night, but it is a big challenge. I think there are a couple of ways. I don't think there's a single solution to that problem. If I look at what we're doing with DSL technology today, UVerse, our video product, runs on twisted pair copper lines. Now, if I went back to some of the people that I worked for when I started in this business 30 years ago and said, you know, we're running those old twisted pair copper lines at, you know, 65, 70 megabits per second in ideal cases, they'd think I was out of my mind. But the fact of the matter is we're running multiple HD streams, we're running high-speed internet services on twisted pair lines. So one answer in my mind is continuing to look at what the next wave of technology is. When we first started deploying DSL, I was a chief technology officer at Bell South, and we were able to get up to like 6 megabits per second. And I went to some of our researchers and I said, well, how far can this technology go? What can we expect? And they quoted Shannon's theorem and Nyquist sampling rates and things that I hadn't thought of in 20 years, but they said, Bill, 6 megabits per second, that's it. That's as far as it can go. Well, now we're routinely running, I mean, a lot of our UVerse customers will sync at 50, 60, 65 megabits per second in an ideal situation. Well, have we changed Shannon's theorem or Nyquist sampling rate? Have we learned how to change fundamental physics? No. But what we've been able to do is do things like, for example, one of the breakthrough technologies was the ability on a line card to look at multiple frequency. You folks know what MIMO is, multiple input, multiple output. It's kind of a form of MIMO on DSL. So if you're looking at multiple frequencies and you see you've got an interferer at one frequency, you have to be really careful when you do this little demonstration. But if you can say, well, I can in real time monitor that interference level take that out, and then look at the other 3 or 4 frequencies, you can take care of that noise problem and bump the signal back up. So I believe there's still life in that wireline last mile technology, but I think wireless is finally getting to the point where it truly is becoming a more viable last mile technology. And that's one of the, there's work going on now with things called, a lot of people refer to it as liquid radios. I'm not sure exactly where the term came from, but basically being able to look at all the spectrum that exists at a particular point in time. For example, this wireless microphone is using a assigned slot of spectrum. What happens when there's nobody in here using a wireless microphone? Nothing. It goes unutilized, right? Liquid radios are looking around to say what spectrum is there that's available and can I use it? So it is one of the biggest issues. I don't worry about backbone systems. Fiber optic systems are going to get faster. Core routers are going to get faster. You know, Cisco's building routers now that, you know, a single router can handle all the capacity that the entire world used just a couple of years ago. And so I don't worry about that part, but your question is a great one. That last mile part is still a challenge. I don't think it's an insurmountable one, but I don't think there's a single solution either. I think we got to look at multiple technologies and multiple approaches. Yes, sir.
This is in a way a follow-on to his question. It's more, is it possible to allocate enough capital to keep up with consumer demand for bandwidth in that last mile? Or are we stuck in this perpetual catch-up situation?
You know, it's one of the guys I work with spent a number of years in Houston in the boom days of the oil industry, and he said our job is just like the people building roads in Houston in the early '80s. When you opened a new highway, it was immediately full. That's kind of the way I feel. We go out and deploy $20 billion, and guess what? I'm working every day to try and say this market is about to exhaust. We've really got to work on that, and so. But it's not just the last mile, though. I guess the key point would be, in my mind, usage drives throughout the entire network. I remember being in Washington one time, meeting with the staff of one of the, at the time, most powerful senators in D.C. And you know, we were talking about net neutrality, a lot of policy issues, and she said, "I don't get it." She said, "You know, another internet company, I won't quote by name, was in here last week, and they said that, you know, this is crazy that you guys are talking about this usage in the network." And I just turned over a piece of paper and drew a little stick map and said, let's assume I've got a DSL customer in Charleston, South Carolina, and they're doing a Microsoft update from Redmond or wherever Microsoft has to have. I said, if you look at this map, this last mile, that's a fixed cost. Everything else from 5,000 feet or less for that customer to Redmond and back has a usage-based element because it's in the shared network. I told her at the time, I said, if we really wanted to price broadband correctly, we'd price it A plus BX, where A covered the fixed cost and BX covered usage. This little insight into Washington, she said, whoa, whoa, whoa. And it bothered me. I thought, did I offend her? What happened? And this person was a Ivy League school educated attorney. And I said, what's wrong? She said, when I came to Washington, they assured me there'd be no math involved. So help me God. That's it. But so the point is, it's not just the last mile. That's probably the most visible one. But the whole ecosystem has costs, whether you're doing we carry now with the network we carry a lot of our own traffic end to end, but where you've got peering agreements with other people, the whole internet architecture is in some ways designed to incent a little bit of gaming. You know, hot potato routing, if you're not familiar with it, the game you played as a kid with a hot potato, get rid of as soon as you can. That's the way the whole routing protocol internet's based is if I've got traffic that I'm trying to deliver to you, I'm going to hand it off as quickly as I can. So if I've got video servers in Dallas and you're in Raleigh, the first peering point I can find to hand that traffic to another operator, I'm going to hand it off. So the whole ecosystem basically has cost driven by usage, and that's probably what the industry, I think, is wrestling with right now. You know, I think we'll find a solution. I think we'll find a reasonable solution, but right now it's kind of interesting to me that, you know, everybody understands that whether it's milk, bread, gasoline, electricity, anything else we get, the more we consume, the more we cost. But we've not quite figured out that the same principle really applies to networking technology. We've been riding the, you know, the performance curves for quite some time, and that helps a lot. But I think we're at a point right now where demand is way outpacing what we can expect from performance increases, and we'll find a way through that. Yes, sir.
You mentioned a point about trust but benefit, which is regarding that. A lot of people say that leadership is not about winning a popularity contest, and they use that as a justification for micromanagement. What's your opinion about micromanagement?
I'm a big believer in what I call situational leadership. You don't manage everybody the same way. If I've got someone working for me who has got all the experience, all the capability, demonstrated the ability to execute, by and large, I'm going to tell that person, you keep on track, you let me know if you need something, and I'm going to try and stay the heck out of their way. Particularly if I've got a long history with that person and I know I can trust they're going to deliver. If I've got somebody else that's given me excuse after excuse after excuse, I'm very capable of becoming a micromanager. But I don't try and apply the same approach to everybody that works for me. So generally speaking, micromanagement is not a good approach. People don't like it. You won't find a micromanager with a large team of people that's getting really high ratings. I'll promise you that. It sometimes is necessary, however. It's just not the standard way. My father passed away a couple of years ago, and he was a pretty wise guy. He wasn't an educated guy, but he was a wise guy in a positive thing. Intelligent guy, not a wise guy. Not Jersey Shore wise guy, intelligent guy. And he told me when I first started supervising people, he said, you know, you'll find most of your people you can lead, a few you have to drive. And so I think micromanagement applies sometimes where you got somebody who's not getting the job done. And maybe you go back to my whole question, is it skill versus will? But you can't just sit back and keep hoping it's going to get better, I will tell you, because that's going to get that person in trouble and you in trouble as well. You have to do something. And sometimes micromanagement is the approach, but that's not the way to do it on a standard basis. I would strongly encourage you to stay away from that. I'm getting to answer one more question and we'll wrap up. Yes, sir.
You touched on this briefly, but as president of network operations, you must come into the network neutrality debate quite often. What kind of leadership decisions have you had to make regarding network neutrality?
You know, that's not a decision that you can do on your own. I did, in my Bell South days, I spent a lot of time in Washington trying to educate people on those issues. So it's not, you know, I would say if there's a leadership issue on that, it is how do you explain and educate so people really understand that, yeah, more usage does drive more cost. You know, I was on a panel one time with a CEO, it was actually a Senate hearing, and the CEO of a kind of a startup internet company said, I don't understand the big deal about, you know, at that time part of the issue was do you offer high quality of service for some applications or not? And the fact of the matter is I was involved in a lot of the protocol design. Protocol, as you know, was designed with quality of service, class of service, right? Because different things, VoIP needs a high class of service. It can't handle latency. You might be able to handle some packet discard on VoIP, but you can't handle latency, right? On the other hand, email, latency's not a big deal. Do I care if I get my email a quarter of a second later than I would have? So the protocol was designed for those things, but there were people that were arguing, well, you shouldn't apply that. All traffic ought to be treated the same way. And the answer was, well, I don't understand. The power company doesn't care what I plug in the outlet in my house. I said, no, but the meter's running. You know, if you want to solve the whole discussion, you can go to usage-based on everything and solve it. But so I think the leadership in that situation is a little bit different. You make a really good point, though. Leadership is not just in the people who have a reporting structure to you. Leadership can be with your peers, can be with your superiors, can be with regulators, can be with politicians. Leadership is a broad context. And I will tell you, in my experience in Bell South, I loved to find product managers or program managers to promote, people that were successful. And I'll tell you why. The way we were structured, they led a team, a fairly large team of people that didn't report to them, didn't sign their appraisals, didn't determine whether they got a raise or not. You show me somebody that can successfully lead a team who they have no pure hierarchical authority over, they're going to be a good leader in most any setting. So that's, I think, how you do it. But you have to adapt, certainly if you're in a regulatory environment or that kind of thing. Leadership is a little bit different. But look, we're out of time. I've really enjoyed being with you today. Thanks for your attention.